So, I'm Colter. We're continuing from a brief discussion about architecture that happened, a couple of weeks to a month ago. But I guess now I'm doing a brief recap on the Plume Studio project, the brief we got assigned, our goals for development, and what I delivered by the end. So, the studio was called Recovering Urban Memory. We were supposed to deliver a new idea of a farmer's market in the Batasi Historic District in Beijing. It's an interesting historical site due to regional law. There's limited development that can occur there, so much of it has been stalled in terms of development since the post-war period. We were told that there's an interesting condition in the negative space between dwellings. What they called the hutong was like an alleyway, and that these alleyways kind of crisscross around in this district. So this is our actual district, our block, and this red volume here was our site, very large considering the density of the region around it. We were next to a Buddhist temple as well as a smaller monastery that was out of commission. And we were handed a bunch of interesting documentation about the site over the past 60 years. So the farmers market we visited in person. It was basically closed down in the early 2010s after being briefly redeveloped. And so the current site, this smaller volume here, was a parking lot, and this was the kind of dilapidated, falling apart farmers market from, I guess, the 70s. So I couldn't tell you, I guess I already lost the sense of scale for the site, but it's quite big considering each of these smaller volumes is like a house or a shop. And here are some photos. So this was the farmers market when it was in use, and they built a brick wall around it to close it off. So part of the brief was like reimagining what it means to have a successful farmers market or cultural center within this district. And so this is what we visited the site in early 2019. This is what it looked like. It was just hard ceramic tile surfaces, concrete, and exposed structure. So as you can see here, you're looking through, and there's an alleyway that comes around the outside edge. So there's actually, you can walk around the entire site. And then there's a rooftop terrace that was at one point, I guess, a cafe. And you could see this Buddhist temple here. I'm going to skip forward a little bit. This is that parking garage, so this low region here. And then here's the hutong right outside. So this is our farmers market, and then it's very dense urban fabric on the outside. And here's this the existing farmers market, and this is the Buddhist monastery here. So there's like a slim alleyway, and in terms of the project brief, we were told not to occupy. We had to keep this alleyway intact around the building. So I'm going to skip the deliverables. I'm going to go right into my initial design ideas. The first thing I did was we received a site plan from Vector Architects, who were sponsoring the studio. The black volumes represent an older version of the urban fabric, and the lighter gray regions represent a more recent infill. So we received two different site plans with incongruent information. So I created what I called a merged Noli plan just to see these different conditions in the way that these maps overlapped. And you can see in the center, this hole here represents our area to build. And my question was, after going to the site, how do I become sensitive to the scale and the density of the area? I wouldn't want to put down a giant monolithic building in that hole. So this is the first idea, was to take the dimensions of the storefronts and copy them over. So maybe I can zoom in here. You're seeing these small lines are cutting across. And we jump in and out of the larger main street, the hutong, and we draw in people. We create these specific moments to help break down the form, and then we just keep this. So this was the first thing I drew to design the project, but and I drifted away from it, but I actually moved back towards the end. And this is where I had a lot of fun. I definitely confused other people in the studio with this plan, but since I had a merged Noli map and Photoshop has content-aware fill, it's a tool that analyzes patterns around a region and tries to infill, I tried to imagine or use the tool to imagine what the infill could look like if there were no building there. And this was not necessarily a way to prescribe my own design, but to think about the scale of discrete components within my site. So if I were to break down my larger volume into smaller ones, what could those be doing? As well, like, could I create larger courtyards? And there's also a spot to interpret, like, what does this semi-shaded region versus this hard poché mean? And I call these exercises surrealist, meaning I'm not quite in control of the process, but I can generate 20 iterations and start to judge them and work on them. And it's a way to break the ice. And this is all in an effort to consider the density and the patterns in the fabric. And I only have limited experience of that. And so that was the first exercise I did. And I'm going to go right into my development process after that exercise. So the way that I really developed my building was on top of a site plan. So I figured out a scale that was appropriate. In this case, it was 500 to 1. And I tried to create as good as a representation of the site I could on a single 8.5 by 11 sheet, which I would print out, and then I would draw directly on it. So I was actively printing out, referencing, drawing, and then rescanning into the computer. And this is my first site plan. And if you see this blue region, this is like the outer dimension. I believe this ended up being the plate that we built upon for the site model. And this red line here represents basically my buildable volume. So I can occupy up to that edge, but not beyond. So you see there's like a weird kink here. And so very simply, I started to identify angles within the site that I could carry onto my plan. One of the most important parts of this initial proposal was to create a large courtyard, and these are trees, because this area has been overdeveloped and over-infilled over time, and so I wanted to restore a traditional green courtyard to it. The other thing I wanted to do with this plan was to create these walls to divide the space and then have spaces like this cafe that bleed out and begin to occupy this alleyway. And then I wanted to create a rhythmic volume of these walls that you would kind of enter in from the hutong and be able to cross through the building. And then I would be able to hide utilities or other stalls in these. This very thick poché I hadn't at that point figured out what it would be, but I was thinking a big thick wall. And then I would have this kind of logical volume here as well as columns. So in terms of structure, I can be pretty confident I could turn this into a usable building. I have large shear walls that I'm dividing up the space and creating these residual volumes inside. As well, I have pretty consistent sizing for my bays, which makes the logic of the building much easier. And I was already starting to do some consideration of where staircases would go. I was thinking of a rooftop terrace up here in the same place that the original market had one, so that you could see into this large roofscape around. Most of these buildings are like 1 story tall, so as soon as you get up that high, you can see very far. So that was my first iteration, and I can jump up to my 500 to 1 scale models. So at each one of my iterations, I actually created a small model that would slot into this very large site model. So this is actually my final model, but you can see here's our large temple. This is a large housing development. We have these alleyways, and we can occupy this space around us. So my first model had this large courtyard. I had a 2nd story kind of viewing platform. I had this kind of walkway, and the way that I sliced it, I created this moment where the alleyway starts very thin and then it gets larger and wider until you get to this cafe here. And then that energy or that motion continues straight through into the courtyard. And then I had this ribbed roof line element that continued all the way across, and that was really just replicating the roofing structures from the smaller dwellings around the site. And after some initial reviews, I realized that I had underscaled my elements, so my cafe was monstrously small. And so my second iteration was about how I can increase the size of some of these elements. So this thing here became this cafe, and it became kind of a glass flat element. And it's kind of regrettable, but the second iteration was really thinking about this wall, this continuous element, as an organizing element. So this became a dominant structure. And so it comes in and it starts zigzagging, and it creates these openings on the 2nd floor. So another thing that I added, so this is a 1 story tall bay system. what happens here is there's actually a staircase at the end of the alleyway, and you get this rooftop walkway where you can walk between these roof bays and then walk onto that terrace. So I wanted to create a second story alleyway that came through the building. And then I had a second story element here that came to the front. I think I can show, this was the 3D model of that portion. This was a little bit before I had the very tall wall here, but I had this idea of like a large courtyard with 2 floors that could become offices or administration spaces, and then this kind of strange mixture of this unifying element and then these discrete elements for the stalls essentially. So let me jump back to the models. This gave way after I talked with Shomu about urban design elements. As well, the wall eventually became problematic, so the wall disappeared, and I began to stress continuous roof elements instead of this wall element. So would you like to jump in about thinking about site?
Yeah, so when I looked at Colter's design, it was really interesting, and also what really attracted me was the fabric around it. So I was trying to find a commonality between the designed form and the fabric. So they had a really interesting model, and the scale was really appropriate to understand how the built form and the open space works, because I have not been in this city, so I was only looking at this model and some photographs that they had from their visit. So I wanted to understand how, I was like looking for a possibility of how the alleyway can become in Colter's. Can you show the 4 models that you have, the 4
Sure.
iterations?
Yeah.
So when I was looking at iteration number 2, I was trying to find out how the circulation space in that open, the unifying walking element that he had could talk to the experience of walking at large in around the urban context. So that's why I had this idea of, I just suggested him that maybe you can make it an extension of an alleyway at an upper level, so that the experience of walking in the alleyways around the building, around the market, would kind of blend in with the walking experience inside it. So that kind of gave way to iteration 3, and you can explain more how
Right.
you actually got it
I think
done.
that the second idea that really changed the way I approached the design was, I think you identified that this really long straightaway was kind of problematic, maybe unnatural at this scale. And what you suggested was shifting these bays here. So I have 1, 2, 3 here. And so I actually take this one here and I shift it so it sits against this alleyway. This one stays here against this larger alleyway. And then we have this unit in the middle that becomes a little bit smaller. And so instead of climbing up the staircase here and continuing straight, you climb up the staircase and around, and then you continue in the front so you can see on this side of the building, and then you take a right and you're now under a shaded canopy, and you continue here into the corner, and here you're seeing this like more quiet alleyway. And that's when you tuck in under this secondary canopy, and these are both 2-story volumes. This one being the cafe/tea house, and this one being more of a administration offices, main entrance, and I was also thinking at a time, a bookshop.
Yeah.
So that's
what was very interesting, that kind of gave way to a kind of depth in the elevation of the building as well, which was very uniform till the previous one. Not necessarily that's not something desirable, but this one kind of gave, like, in the elevation you could see human movement. So people walking in the front part where you get up from the staircase would become part of the elevation when the building experience from the street. Thus, the street on the upper level has kind of a possibility of a dialogue with the street that surrounds the building at large. And that was, I think, my humble suggestion about integrating into the urban environment in a way. And that shows in the models as well.
Right, so this is the first 100-to-1 scale model. It's about 5 times larger than those first models. And here you're seeing this is a cafe, this is a rentable room, that staircase comes up and you're zigzagging, and then you tuck into this. So these are like more regular buildings. Then this is this semi-open bay system for the farmer's market. So it becomes a little bit more flexible. The other thing was the courtyard was a square element and was very central, and it became more of a residual space between these 2 buildings. And here the wall is still dominant at the end, and that eventually went away as well. So here was actually the Midterm Pinup. And you can see as I developed at the same scale using the 8.5 by 11 in sheets, I was able to just pin up all these different resolutions as well as my different physical models at the same scale, which allowed the reviewers to compare all these different options and see what they liked and what they didn't like. So having this process in a unified way, using the same process to develop all of your plans, really helps to clarify your project and where you're going. It also helps the reviewers identify if you're making any mistakes or any opportunities. I also created a small scheme. So I was labeling programs here, and this is just a flat sheet that I mounted on cardboard. As well, I extensively used computer modeling to help make sure my dimensions were correct, but then I would print that out and actually draw over that to develop details that I didn't want a 3D model at the time. And here is a quick axonometric, which just shows this continuous second floor walkway. In addition to that, I started to develop perspectival views at the midterm. And so this was with my 3D model. I printed out very lightly and then just started drawing over with a pen to imagine what that experience is like. So I was thinking of it in terms of a storyboard. What would a person see when they walked in? So this is my marketplace. This is the existing street, which functions as a marketplace already with all these shops. And I also wanted to include things like power lines that are not often included that help add character to the scene. This would be that residual space. So this is the cafe, this is the bookstore, and here are those 3 trees in the courtyard. So this is that occupiable space. This would be the tea house. So this is that courtyard we were just in. And I was already exploring like, okay, this giant wall thing, and that's a little bit annoying, but this thick wall here can become a bookcase. It can light things, it can store things, and that becomes part of presenting the culture and the history of the area. This would be the actual marketplace. So what you're seeing here is going across the building at that thin section, and you're actually seeing that Buddhist monastery across. So we're creating a continuity from one alleyway into the market hall, into the secondary alleyway, and then across and into the Buddhist temple, Buddhist monastery. Let's see, other way. And this is the bookstore. This did not make it into the final project, but one of the larger volumes, I was thinking like, okay, can I use wood as an element? And can I turn the wall into this gigantic storage system? And in terms of the concept, one of my first ones that I wanted was how the objects become encased into the architecture. I noticed that in community halls in the Batasi district, there was a lot of well-maintained objects from different time periods, and those objects became markers and identifiers for the people in the region. So I wanted to maintain that. So that was the midterm. I got a lot of feedback, and that's when I think between the midterm and the final, the overall form is still there. Instead of having 2 buildings and a courtyard in the center here, it became 1 volume, and that courtyard got shifted all the way against the edge of the boundary of the site. So I can go back to these models. So you can see the first move that I made was I was like, I'm creating residual. I have 2 residual negative spaces in the building, and that's, if I want to maximize the open green space in my plan, I should really think about incorporating this alleyway here into the green space, and so that's where I have this single shading element, a large volume here, which becomes the tea house, and then again I have this very, very similar system here, except I created a unifying horizontal roof element that would kind of become the signature element of the project. Let's see. So here's the model without the roof on. Here's that second elevated walkway. And then I added a second staircase here. In the midterm, there was a staircase here, and then I just shifted so that these 2 butt up against each other. And then this became a very simplistic, it's very much inspired by Renzo Piano's modern gallery for the Art Institute of Chicago. In a way, I was like trying to study how Renzo Piano handled envelopes, separating different envelopes, so like vapor barrier, moisture barrier, and then sun. And that's in service, this is mostly in service of creating a set of entryways into this larger volume in the back that becomes the tea house. This is also coinciding with the need to develop an interior. We were told during the project brief that we needed to develop a very large scale. This is 1:35, so this figure here was about 1.5 inches tall. We had to fully develop an interior model, so this is a physically modeled space. There were a few restrictions, so typically 1-point perspective, and well lit. We had to recreate the context around the building as well to appear in the photo. And so this large volume kind of came out of a need to develop a space at a certain scale with the materials in place. And I guess in the proposal, I was thinking about hand washing stations here before you enter into the market hall back here. This kind of like floating plane with stone and ceramic tile on the walls is like this kind of, I don't want to say transcendent, but it's supposed to be super calming and restful. And then you get this tree-lined courtyard out here that allows you to view nature from inside the volume. And then this green stuff down here would be a moss garden. So I noticed that on all the old buildings on these ceramic roof tiles, they would grow moss over time. And I wanted to celebrate moss as this sort of green element within the district. So I can show you, this was the outer portion. And in order to develop these textures, so we had a 3D model of the site. I actually took photos from our site visit, and I basically used texture mapping to map those photos onto planes. So this existing building, this is the Buddhist monastery. I actually got all the textures from photos and just printed them out. I think they're mounted on cardboard. And this is a very simple way of bridging kind of digital representation and physical ones. I actually modeled this entire thing in the computer. You know, I went from 1:1 scale to 1:35, and I was starting to think about, all right, am I 3D printing these structural elements? This is made out of acrylic. I mount the mullions on these. So this is like just model making know-how. And here's our very large 500:1 model. I basically 3D printed a white volume, and then I had these, I think I 3D printed in clear plastic, and I just mounted that to the roof. So I don't expect to fully detail every version of the model. I always think about abstracting. So like what's important? What's important for the 500:1 is just the stepping in and out, the trees, which are basically styrofoam with little dowels in them, and then this like extra shading. That's all I really cared about for this 500:1. I also had to develop a ceramic tile. I don't know if that's actually important, but this is a pit-fired ceramic tile that I produced from a 3D printed mold. So part of the studio was also exploring like, all right, you want to use ceramic, you need to produce some. It was a very valuable experience. Other students produced concrete bricks. Some of them were working with wood and plaster. I was instantly like interested in ceramics, and I was like, can I make a pattern that you want to touch? And then because I couldn't get access to a kiln, I actually used recycled wood chips and a terracotta pot to fire this. So it was basically kiln free. Let's see, was there any other material? So here's that 100:1 model. And yeah, and this was all MDF plate that fit into a larger MDF site model. I basically printed out my plans from Rhino. So I developed 2D plans from Rhino. And then I usually do pochés and fills in Photoshop. So like I had this very nice plan, and I used spray adhesive to mount the plan on top of the MDF, and I use that for reference for assembling the model. I extensively use the printers and plotters to plot out my plans, and I actually incorporate that into the model. And it makes it so that I don't have to measure and cut pieces by hand. And so like it also, by mounting this paper, I'm able to give it a much cleaner finish. As well, like some of these components, like this front wall here, that was 3D printed in white plastic, as well as the staircases. So very early in, as I'm resolving the model, I'm thinking about components and how I can 3D print them, if that makes my life easier. As well, like these kind of wooden mullions are laser cut from mat board. And I believe that they're spray painted afterwards to make them look cleaner. I can be a little bit obsessive about having clean models. And by basically creating a Rhino model and using, and you're seeing some of the line work here maybe, being very careful about like laser cutting these. This was actually made out of maple, these thicker wall elements that are kind of structural. I really wanted to make sure everything lined up perfectly. And so I used a laser cutter for these elements. And when I go down to this scale, I basically don't make any elements smaller than 1 millimeter across. So even though in real life these would be much thinner, like at a model at this scale, you don't want to be working with super thin members because they burn or they fall apart. And so by basically trying to maximize the amount of computer assisted from laser cutting to plotting and hand cutting. Basically, I can hand cut from whatever the computer plots out on the printer in terms of line work. I can get a very precise model that's very true to the digital one. The other thing about this was I put a lot of effort into this model in a way because during the review, I want the reviewers to look at the model instead of my graphics. Graphics can be confusing. There's a mental load in trying to parse them. If you have a very good model, then the reviewers just look at that and they get a much better understanding of how the building works and how it's organized. During the final review, these models were pinned up on my board, and here I actually printed out on the board. I had light lines for the context, and then for the final one, I actually used it as a way to call out these different functions in the program, and so that helps the readability. So there are a few redundant graphics. I understood that people would be walking in front of the poster. This was part of an exhibition, and I wouldn't be there to explain the different parts to them, so I was thinking about, could I provide labels in a way that, you already have a 3D model, you can walk around it, you can see it in 3D, and then do you have an idea of what the programmatic functions are? So that was as well, this is telling a story of how the project is being developed in these different stages. I also gave them names that attempt to describe what was going through my head at the time, which I think adds a lot of clarity to the project. I guess I had no more material to cover. For the final, we weren't supposed to use computer graphics, but I ended up doing very simple computer renderings in Enscape, and I just printed them out and mounted them on cardboard cards. These did not get as much love as the midterm ones did with the hand drawing, but they're very careful in trying to say this is pulling in from the street. There's a big tree in the center that's an organizing element. As well, these sections are trying to talk about this continuity between alleyway and alleyway. So I view all the graphics as a way to reinforce this desirable goal, which for me was this continuity between these two sides. I guess I don't have anything else to say about the project unless you have questions.
Yeah, first of all, thanks a lot, Colter and Soumya, for sharing your project. I think we all learned a lot from this whole discussion. I had one question that how was your design process evolved over the years from your undergraduate to graduation?
I became much more skeptical over time of the computer as a design tool. When you draw a box on the computer, whether that's in Illustrator or that's in Rhino, you have to be very precise in how you do it. And so, in the beginning, I did the surrealist exercises, but also just printing out your material so you can get the accuracy of the digital, at least in terms of scanning it and entering it back into Rhino, but giving yourself the ability to have less resolved development, especially at the beginning of the project. If I were to work from Revit for the first proposal, I would have to be confronting very specific questions about the project that I wasn't ready for. And so in my studio, as I transitioned from undergraduate to graduate school, I began to incorporate more handwork into my process. And it's not just about thinking it's more beautiful or more impressive. I think it actually makes you faster and more efficient. And so I'm always thinking about what tool am I using at what time? Am I going full digital? Am I going analog? And having a printer that's at hand and ready to use so that you can just start drawing and referencing, that became super important. So I had a small black and white, very cheap used printer under my desk, and it got a lot of use. So almost all these photos of my development are drawings on top of things that I printed out. And in cases like this, I was able to use a light table, so you can actually stack trace paper or printer paper up and then just start referencing the lines. And so that came out of a competition I did in the middle of graduate school where I worked with an older architect. And the use of trace paper and light tables in bringing lines from the site context onto your site and helping to develop your building. I became very sensitive about what's happening on the site and how can the building respond to that. When you're working in the computer alone in a 3D modeling engine, some of these intuitions become harder and harder to have. So that's where drawing, they don't even have to be pretty drawings, just to help you develop your own plan can be really important. And yeah, keeping keeping all this material at hand became very important to me too. So I actually like scanned all of these using a phone app so that I could reference them. So here, like, I actually drew this, scanned it into the computer, and printed it off again so I could go over it in Sharpie. You know, like this was like really helpful for me to explore, like, okay, this is an organizing element. What are some options for me? So that's like increasing your flexibility.
And can you share like what other hacks similar to like when you shared like having a printer on hand saved a lot of time? So are there any other hacks?
Yeah, I think I mentioned this is another hack. So like you don't have to. I'm going to try and write down a few of these hacks. So like the first one is like you can print out or reference something from the computer and just draw over it in perspective. So this was like super early. I wasn't going to show this. I was like, what are the dumbest things I can do? Like I like to generate 10 stupid versions of the building, and hopefully like I can break the ice and start to think about things a little bit more clearly. And so these are like, this has ended up being the closest to what I ended up doing, this little draw over. But this was like first or second day in Photoshop, just like draw it in perspective and like how does it look, how does it feel on the street at scale. And these are not necessarily things I ever pinned up or showed anyone, but like I was treating them as an exercise, and it's like the more of them you can churn out, the more iterations you can have, the more sketches you can have. I think it begins to clarify. It starts to answer really big questions about what you're doing, and like at that phase in the project, it's important to like start to hone in on the very broad picture of what's going on. So sometimes working in perspective can help, and I mentioned that with the midterm too, printing out the renders and filling in the detail. This is a really excellent way to begin to like develop your own thoughts on like when you're hand drawing it, it's much easier to be like, all right, so is this wood? Is this ceramic? Is this stone? Another thing I was already talking about before was like always abstract. So like I had a very highly detailed 3D model, but for 500:1 scale, I literally created a unique, highly abstracted version of it. So I don't have to fiddle with the 3D printer as much. I can guarantee that it's going to print out these shapes for me. So like sometimes things that you think will save you time, like just using your fully detailed model for something else, don't actually save you time. They introduce headaches. Another thing that is true of my renderings as well as my that model photo was when you work in one-point perspective, the amount of information you need to include goes down a lot. So if you're seeing like almost, besides this, which was like a site render from Midterm, almost all of these are actually one-point perspectives. So there's symmetry. In this case, I thought this rendering is very useful to me because it decenters my proposal. I think too often renderings focus on the building as an object, and I think people are far happier to consider the building more as a background element or as a player in a scene. And so thinking about rendered views as a way to decenter your building, but try to utilize the site itself to help sell your plan. This is like a change in how I approached my own work. And as well, like in terms of modeling, like this 1-point perspective is way less detailed than it would have to be if I did a 2-point. 2-point, doubles the amount of things that you're seeing. As well, like if you're doing a 1-point perspective rendering, you can much more easily Photoshop things like textures in. And so I highly recommend using your 1-points where they're applicable. I usually have like 1 or 2 2-points if it's a very information dense rendering. But in these cases, it becomes much easier to produce them in mass. As well, if all of your renderings are 1-point, then they're having a happy conversation on your board. If you're seeing 6 of these renderings next to each other, they're all kind of in the same format. So they begin to blend together, and they're more of a cohesive visual element on your board. I might be able to jump to my full board just to show. And I don't think these ones were actually on my board. These renderings were not required. And so don't be afraid to print out materials like renderings, put labels on them, draw over them, and mount them on foam core or cardboard and hand them to your reviewers. Hand your reviewers a postcard-sized object that they can inspect on their own time. I got so many more interesting questions from reviewers who were inspecting my renderings in their hands and asking about certain details. As well, when you hand things to people physically, I think they respond a lot better than having to kind of squint and like look at your boards. So bring your content to them. Like in terms of the requirements, I had to have these floor plans on, but I understood like if my models were nice enough, they weren't going to look at the floor plans, right? So like these were just empty space. I think people would look at the largest element, this render, that I call it a rendering. It's a photo that acts like a rendering. I had supplementary renderings. Mounting these tiny little models to the board, it was really helpful, and I think people get a lot more information out of 3D stuff. So don't be afraid to incorporate that into your board. And then, yeah, this was like all this extra material that I just handed to the reviewers. I made it available, and it starts showing the process. I think I had a midterm model down here too, my midterm drawings, my final renderings, this ceramic tile that I produced. And then this is that really, really large 35:1 scale model. Let me think for a second about other hacks. Plaster-based paint. So Rust-Oleum has something called chalked paint, but adding plaster to something like acrylic paint gives it a much more interesting texture. This was something we realized a little bit into the studio. So this is the cheapest insulation foam that we CNC cut, and then we handmade these larger buildings. It was, I don't want to say gross looking, but it was like fuzzy and inaccurate. But when we coated it twice with this gray chalked paint, it looked like concrete. And I think more and more students are starting to use this paint because it can cover almost anything. So this is actually 3D print. This is the foam. When it covers things, it really makes it look uniform, and I think that helps to kind of enhance your presentation. I don't think I have anything else. Do you have any questions?
Yeah, and what was your distribution of time between digital model, physical model, and representation?
So this is one thing about this early process. This early process in helping to solve the big questions about what your building looks like, what its aesthetic is, and what it's doing. Like this early work saves you tons of time at the end. It's my belief that you should really be converging on a design instead of, I think there's an exploratory period, and that's why I have these surreal exercises, but the more large design decisions you're making over the course of the project, the less time you have to represent. And that's where saving time with like using hand drawings instead of making tons and tons of digital iterations could really help you save time. Using different modeling materials, so like instead of 3D printing every iteration, maybe hand cutting foam. So I think it's about making smaller decisions that can increase your efficiency in terms of time. I really couldn't tell you my division of labor. It's a little bit too far back. I know that once I figure out a good layout, and I think I mentioned this one was like I overestimated the amount of space I had. So that was something I could be blissfully unaware of as I was drawing it, so that like dimensionality was not restricting me. But I scan it, I put it into Rhinoceros, and here I just take that texture, I put it on a plane, and I can draw over it in Rhino. I can start to measure this distance from here to here or here to here and be like, all right, no, this is incorrect. And then that can help inform me about when I do drawings in the future. I believe I also had versions, I didn't photograph them, but I actually created grid lines. I just had a sheet of grid lines at a certain scale that I could add on top in on the light table. So I could use that to reference. And ultimately, with the plan, it became about creating a bay size that was similar to the existing buildings on the site that just carried through basically the whole building. So it's very consistent, very rational in the end. Despite looking irregular, there's like a very deep and consistent grid rationality that continues through it. And so over time, as my structural systems were coming online, it actually gave me the opportunity to start to simplify things. As well, I have very like simple rules that may or may not help me. Like I usually oversize doors and say, okay, this is going to be 3 feet. My public staircases are usually 5 feet across, and I believe this one might be 4 feet across. So like I have these like go-to dimensions that might be oversized, but in terms of resolving, like as I go on, like I can always make it a little bit smaller. Yeah. Also, like I don't, in terms of producing these graphics, these were not really in Rhino. These pochés were not in AutoCAD or Rhino or Revit. Like, I literally work in Photoshop for most of my floor plans once I get to a certain point, because I understand it's faster. So I will export the lines from Rhino, and then I will just start filling in or creating these darker pochés. And I usually have a system having a very, very light gray shading just to show interior versus exterior volumes. This is something I picked up from websites like ArcDaily. Ways to increase the readability of your graphics, because it's you can make it super standard, but there are certain small moves you can make to increase the readability of your graphics, so the reviewers are not trying as hard to understand it. And here, I don't need a grid line because all of these elements align to the grid. So if your building is very rational, you don't need as many external markers. And if a person understands, I actually have tiny little furniture, it might be hard to see, but I include small furniture in the plan, not because I had a super well resolved layout, but it also helps people realize the scale. So there are a lot of small things you can do to increase the readability of the graphics that may not be super intuitive, but over time they build up. And here you're seeing the white roofscape, and then this gray poché pretty clearly shows you here's the path, here's where you can walk. A standard graphic would show okay, yeah, you have this X here to show that it cuts through, it goes down to the first floor. But if you have this gray poché, it becomes even more clear that this is non-occupiable. Yeah. Oh, and also this stuff, north is always up, and you can have your scale, but these can be pretty tiny. No one actually, I haven't found reviewers actually looking at your scale. They kind of trust it, and if they have enough markers and they trust the design, they're not super strict about it, but yeah, you do need the fundamental knowledge of north is always up even when it's inconvenient, or maybe your north arrow can be skewed just to make it orthogonal, if it's 5 degrees off. Don't overscale a lot of these markers, because if your graphics are strong enough, they don't actually matter, they're not going to be looked at.
Okay. Yeah. I think that's it. Thanks a lot for your time.
All right, excellent.
It was a great presentation.
All right, happy to share. Good luck to all of you if you're watching this far. I think you're in a good position.
Yeah. Is there any way the audience can reach you if they have any query or you want to?
I'm on Instagram. I think if you Google my name, Colter Wehmeier, I'll be in places. So I think I'm not super hard to reach. I will answer email. I'm sure my email is somewhere, my university email. Or on Instagram. Those are the 2 places you can basically reach me.
Okay,